Hi everyone, welcome to the EERI Learning from Earthquakes Alaska Earthquake Reconnaissance Briefing webinar. I'm Maggie Ortiz-Milan and I manage the Learning from Earthquakes program here at EERI, and I'll be moderating today's webinar. We're going to start off with a presentation from Heidi Tremayne at EERI on the EERI response. Then we'll hear from Mike West, who will be providing an overview of the earthquake. Then we'll hear from Amanda Siok on emergency management and response. Then from John Thornely on the geotechnical impacts, and Wael Hassan on the structural engineering impacts. So our first speaker will be Heidi Tremayne. Heidi is the Executive Director of the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. She joined EERI in 2014 and managed many of EERI's projects and programs, including the Learning from Earthquakes program. She became Executive Director in 2017 and now oversees the Institute's many initiatives aimed at reducing earthquake risk. Welcome, Heidi.
Thank you, Maggie. So I'm going to start by giving an introduction to EERI in general, and then talk a little bit more about our Anchorage, Alaska earthquake response. So EERI is the Earthquake Engineering Research Institute. We are a nonprofit, multidisciplinary technical society of experts that are all dedicated to reducing earthquake risk. And we're really proud of our diverse membership. That includes emergency managers, risk analysts, many different fields of engineers, scientists, from social scientists to earth scientists. And all these people work in a variety of types of roles, from researchers to practicing professionals, educators, government officials, building code regulators, and more. And that adds a real diversity to the Institute and allows us to really design activities and programs to reduce earthquake risk from a real broad perspective. We achieve our mission of earthquake risk reduction by organizing our members into volunteer committees, projects, and chapters to achieve the mission. Our mission is to reduce earthquake risk by advancing the science practice of earthquake engineering, improving the understanding of impacts of earthquakes. A key part of that is our Learning from Earthquakes program, and for advocating for comprehensive and realistic measures to reduce the harmful effects of earthquakes. And the LFE program really hits on the improving our understanding, but also on all aspects of our mission here. The Learning from Earthquakes program, often known as LFE, is our flagship reconnaissance program that's been around for nearly 50 years. Its goal is to accelerate and increase learning after earthquake-induced disasters, and those disasters and how they affect the natural, built, social, and political environment worldwide. We bring together multidisciplinary experts so that we can learn lessons from these earthquakes that can better inform earthquake engineering, earthquake science, and risk management practice. We've responded to over 300 earthquakes since our formation of the program 50 years ago, and have produced more than 200 reports or dedicated journals on individual earthquakes to share pertinent lessons to our community. And all of these resources can be found on the Learning from Earthquakes website shown here. Our approach involves many different activities, all designed to increase our learning. As you can see, the list includes vehicles from that are used to gather information, to collaborate and coordinate with others, disseminate our findings, and train new experts so that we can all learn from earthquakes now and in the future. We have a unique role that EERI plays in earthquakes in the United States. That is a formal federally identified role to support the NEHRP agencies. Together with them, we organize and launch technical clearinghouses where reconnaissance information can be coordinated and the findings shared on a regular basis throughout the initial response to the earthquake. We activated and served in this role for the Anchorage, Alaska earthquake by hosting 10 clearinghouse briefing calls that included an in-person briefing location in Anchorage for field team participation. I'm going to describe a little bit more about that technical briefing shortly. So our response to the Anchorage, Alaska earthquake involved 5 different areas here that I will describe. The first is that we launched our virtual earthquake clearinghouse website. We were able to establish this within hours of the earthquake. The purpose to make sure that information and data as it was gathered could be posted. We post that information through a resource library that now has over 20 reports and other resources related to this earthquake. We also have collated over 300 geolocated photos from a variety of researchers in the field. Those photos and the associated data map where they're displayed includes 10 data layers and have been informed by many different reconnaissance tools. EERI has some new tools that we're using to collect data that we had colleagues in the field using, and we're able to incorporate data from EERI colleagues as well as many others and overlay this at this one go-to place for earthquake information. So I encourage you to visit this website after this briefing if you want to learn more or dig into those resources. We also had a virtual earthquake reconnaissance team deploy after the earthquake. This is a new aspect of EERI that we've been developing for the last couple of years, where we have a whole team of volunteers that are ready to activate immediately following an earthquake. And what they do is they start by developing an overview of the impacts, doing a thorough internet search of all the online resources, from social media findings to online reports to any technical announcements that we're seeing from the emergency management field, and they compile it into one big overview to help the Learning from Earthquakes program define their activities, but also to inform the broader membership. We also have this team of virtual volunteers who are ready to activate, and we offered our support to other teams and colleagues in the field and offered their support, and many of them volunteered to help two particular activities. They supported USGS researchers who are studying human behavior by gleaning a variety of internet sources to find video of the human response to earthquakes. They also have been supporting EERI's business impacts team that I'll describe in a moment, gather a list of businesses that have been impacted by the earthquake and suffered damage. So it's a great volunteer effort, and I thank all the VERT volunteers who helped pull together these resources. As I said, we also hosted our Clearinghouse Briefings. This was kind of on behalf of the NEHRP agencies with many participation from many colleagues. We had over 100 participants participate across 10 different Clearinghouse briefing calls. First, they were happening every couple days, and then have expanded into time, and we even had one as recently as January, so that as the information and findings and response continues to this earthquake, we can continue to monitor that over time to inform the broader earthquake community. We also supported and collaborated with 12 reconnaissance teams that joined our briefings to coordinate and collaborate and identify their response in ways that they could align their work. We're also launching what we're calling a business impact reconnaissance team. This is a program that we've been working on, and after 2 pilots for earthquakes in the South Napa earthquake and Cushing, Oklahoma, we're now deploying our business survey again. The objective is to correlate physical damage to businesses, and which is from their lifeline impacts to physical damage to damage and loss of inventory, and then correlate that to how that affected the operation of their business. And using it as a tool to see if we can measure and better understand the keys to business resilience, what makes some businesses more resilient, and what aspects really were beneficial in their response, and seeing kind of some of the cascading impacts of the many different kind of aspects that affect a business operation. This is a well-established survey that we've developed through a group of volunteers over the last several years at EERI that we're hoping to deploy again after future earthquakes. It actually has a series of surveys that can be deployed over time, and the first round of the survey for Anchorage, Alaska will be deployed in February in person by a small team, including some volunteers from Alaska, from our regional chapter. We also have a variety of ways that we're helping to disseminate findings from this earthquake as well. Today's webinar is one of them. We're also having a follow-up session at the 2019 EERI annual meeting. I hope you're all planning to attend. It's going to take place on March 5th through 8th. If you still want to register, there's still room. This particular session is going to be a supplement to this. So it's a whole nother set of presentations sharing even more findings from this earthquake. So it will. We encourage you to watch both for sure. Those who are at the annual meeting are going to see the first preview of it. We will be recording that as well and releasing it later as a webinar a few weeks after the meeting. But I do encourage you to come and attend, and everyone who's present will be able to interact and ask questions of the panelists as well. So it should be another great way to learn more about the findings from this earthquake. Finally, we also have our reconnaissance leads. Wael and John, they're helping us work with many EERI volunteers to pull together a reconnaissance report that will be shared in the coming weeks. And finally, we're also exploring whether there's some way that these findings could make it into earthquake spectra, whether it's through a collection of papers or individual paper submissions, and whether kind of we're still waiting to see if the research and the knowledge developed kind of will scale large enough that we would consider an earthquake spectra special issue. So Earthquake Spectra is our technical journal and a great way that we can kind of share findings after a lot of the research takes place from the initial data collection. So that would be coming in the next year or two. So with that, I think that gives a good overview of EERI response. You're going to hear from a few speakers later, but before we do, I just want to make sure that we acknowledge the many, many people that made this response possible and have supported our efforts. FEMA provided some support through our cooperative agreement. We worked with all the NEHRP partners, FEMA, USGS, NIST, NSF. They participated on our clearinghouse briefing calls and really guided what we were doing. Our reconnaissance co-leads, John Thornely and Wael Hassan, have been a great resource, both local and Alaska, making sure that we can bring all these findings together for you. Golder Associates hosted the in-house briefings. So during our clearinghouse briefing calls, there was a physical location where people in the field could meet. And then, of course, we've had many members in Alaska, members from our VERT group that were helping to pull it together, including our chairs, Erica Fisher and Manny Hakmanashi. We've had our Learning from Earthquakes Committee, EERI staff, and so we're really pleased today that we can have this series of dissemination events to make sure all our members can benefit from all the knowledge that has been gained from this great effort from our members. So with that, thank you, and I think we're ready for our next presentation.
Thank you very much, Heidi. Now we're going to hear from Mike West. Mike is the Alaska State Seismologist and Director of the Alaska Earthquake Center. Mike directs the Earthquake Center in its long-term mission to reduce Alaska's vulnerability to earthquakes through a combination of monitoring, research, and public engagement. As state seismologist, he represents the center to policymakers, state and federal agencies, and the public. So I'll turn it over to you, Mike.
Thank you for bearing with me there. Happy Valentine's Day to everyone. My intent over the next 15 minutes is just to give you a quick summary of the earthquake itself before other folks delve into some of the observations and details. As everyone on this call knows, on the morning of November 30th, there was a magnitude 7 earthquake that occurred just a little bit north of Anchorage, Alaska, at a depth of about 50 kilometers, and that's important. We'll come back to that a few times. Just a quick slide here, which we will also come back to, showing the intensities in qualitative color version as opposed to numbers later on. This is the shake map that the Alaska Earthquake Center produced and that many of you interacted with as it was redistributed through USGS mechanisms. The earthquake that occurred on the 30th was fully consistent with historical seismicity. I can't say that anyone in the geosciences was necessarily surprised by it, though certainly the magnitude and location, it is not a common occurrence. If we look at the figure here on the screen, we're looking at earthquakes of all magnitudes recorded in Alaska over the past year. So this is 2018 seismicity. And I put this up to provide some context for where the November 30 earthquake occurred. The color coding on this slide, red earthquakes are shallow, basically crustal. Yellow earthquakes are intermediate depth, say down to about 120 kilometers, and then the maroon ones are quite deep. And that transition where the November 30 earthquake occurred from red to yellow to green, or to maroon, illustrates that this occurred on the downgoing Pacific plate. We'll take a look at that in a minute. But it's really quite consistent with historical events and smaller magnitude, day-to-day, if you will, seismic activity. So on the next slide here, these are the contours of the Pacific plate down beneath Alaska, beneath the North American plate. And it gives us some context for the 50-kilometer depth of this event. If we do, I'm going to go to the next slide, play a short video. We'll do a 30-second tectonics primer to put this earthquake in context. I'll play this. Forgive me if it's a little jumpy on your end. But if we look at the two plates which come together in Alaska, do a little cross section and look at the Pacific plate as it subducts beneath North America, the location of the November 30 earthquake shown there demonstrates to us that it occurred further down dip than the locked zone, the region where we see big subduction zone earthquakes like 1964. This was more inland or more inboard or down dip, however you want to phrase that. But it is fully consistent with earthquakes. Even just a few years ago, there was a similarly sized earthquake a little bit further to the southwest, magnitude 7.1 in January 2019 at these what we would refer to as intermediate depths. Moving on to the next slide here, this is a cross. Oh, actually, I wanted to point out one thing. Forgive me for backing up here, but something important. You should have in front of you now the slab contours figure. And what I wanted to point out is it comes as a surprise to some people that the direction of subduction in this area is primarily to the west. We think of the Pacific plate often as kind of moving northward, but here there's a bend in the plate, and so the down dip direction is actually to the west or slightly west northwest. All right. The figure on the screen now, which has the main shock labeled and then several days worth of aftershocks, shows the location of the earthquake relative to these two plates, the overriding North American plate and then the subducting Pacific plate. And this is an illustration of two things. One is that this earthquake occurred solidly within the downgoing plate. That's why it didn't rupture toward the surface. There's no surface manifestation of the fault itself. And it also shows that the main shock began, this magnitude 7 began at the southern end of the rupture, and over the course of several seconds, ruptured upward and toward the right of this figure. So the area kind of mapped out by all of the subsequent aftershocks. So it actually started, the earthquake began closest to Anchorage, and over several seconds ruptured about 20 kilometers of fault northward toward, toward the north and away from downtown Anchorage. It's been a very vigorous producer of aftershocks. This is a shot we're looking at of several seismic stations around the Anchorage area just in the hour following the main shock, at which point in time earthquakes were occurring, aftershocks were occurring at least every minute, not necessarily large enough to be felt, but a good percentage of those were. As time has progressed, this is an aftershock figure for the first month, essentially December of 2018. I would point out to you the main shock on November 30th, but followed pretty much immediately by a magnitude 5.7 a few hours later. As the aftershocks have continued, there have been continued earthquakes, occasional, in the magnitude 5 range. There's some anecdotal evidence that aftershocks have done some additional damage in other areas. I'm actually hoping that other speakers might touch on this. Wink, wink. It's certainly, we've heard that from people anecdotally, but I'm not sure of any systematic survey. If we look at the rate of aftershocks over the first 2 months and project forward, if those rates hold, if the rates we've been seeing remain steady, or those patterns remain steady, we expect that within about a year, it will become difficult to distinguish aftershocks from what you might call the routine background of earthquakes that we are accustomed to in this area. This is it's not an aseismic area. There's plenty of earthquakes month to month, year to year, and we're anticipating within about a year we'll be playing that game. Was that an aftershock or was it not? If we look at the mechanisms, the fault mechanisms of the earthquakes, we have moment tensor solutions for quite a number of them. So this is a busy figure. We're looking at seismic stations in blue, but I would draw your eye toward the black and red dots, which indicate the locations of aftershocks. And then there are 10 moment tensor solutions here, all extremely consistent with one another. If this is not a view of fault mechanisms that you are accustomed to seeing, essentially these are classic, very clean. If these were on the surface, we would call them normal faults. Personally, I hesitate to use that word when it's embedded inside a tectonic plate that is deep beneath us, but these are essentially, I think they should be thought of as normal faults. And what they tell us is that those are likely related to extension or tensional forces within the plate. We'll look at a figure in just a moment of that. The other thing I would point out is that, let's see, all of the black dots are the routine locations of these earthquakes. And if we apply some so-called relative relocation techniques, these tighten up a little bit. Those are the red dots on the figure, but let's move, I think we should move on from there. Going back to a figure that we looked at just a moment ago, pulled out of that tectonics video, I've thrown some fault mechanisms, some arrows on top of this that represent what that those moment tensors on the last slide represent. So some combination, as this plate is pulled into the earth, of either tension or bending forces within the plate. I will say at this point in time, there's some evidence that the rupture extended beyond a single fault plane and perhaps involved some motion on two different faults. That is an area of ongoing investigation, so stay tuned. One last thing I wanted to point out about the depth of these earthquakes and this particular mechanism, the reason I'm dwelling on the tectonics, is that there's nothing to map. These are not faults that you can go out and trace on the surface of the earth. They are not features that you can study geologically. And so they present a very real challenge for seismic hazard analysis. We really have very little understanding of when and where earthquakes, well, I guess we know the where, but when earthquakes and of what size earthquakes like this can occur. So that's very different than, it's a different breed of earthquake than the crustal and the shallow features that we are accustomed to being able to measure and integrate cleanly into seismic hazard analyses. With these earthquakes, in many ways, all we have to go with is a relatively short historical record. So unlike a major crustal fault, where we might say, hey, we just had this very significant fault, we're going to consider that section of the fault relieved for now, and maybe we'll focus attention on the surrounding areas. We really don't know what's going on here. It's very hard to speculate on what future earthquakes could or could not look like in this area, or how this particular event changes that understanding. One brief slide on the tsunami aspect of this earthquake. As many people know, the National Weather Service issued a tsunami warning for this. That's been a subject of some debate. I do not speak for the National Weather Service. What I can tell you is, in my opinion, working in the state for many years and having been through some other events like this, the call was prudent. By any measure, this was a potential coastal hazard, though it was unlikely to set up some trans-Pacific tsunami. There are quite a number of coastal failures that we have seen in previous earthquakes that I wouldn't have wanted to be down on the beach on this day, at least not nearby. There are clearly some lessons learned about the delivery mechanisms of warnings. Clearly, the warnings are being spread a little too far to people who certainly don't need it. However, the basic call to issue a warning is, in my opinion, was prudent. Just a couple last slides. I showed this figure early on, showing the intensity of shaking across the region. A couple things to point out. One is that relatively strong shaking, intensity 6 and 7, was felt over a very large geographic region. If you look at the scale bar, I mean, this is a big area we're looking about. Anybody who drove around doing reconnaissance might appreciate that. But what was missing from this is an area of extremely strong shaking. You know, let me stay there for a moment. We have basically very distributed shaking because the earthquake was deep, but we were spared the near fault extreme shaking, you know, things up toward, you know, 1G or something. No, none of that occurred because nobody was actually close to this rupture. Even if you were on the surface of the earth above it, you were still the better part of, you know, 50 kilometers away from the rupture itself. So I think that's a lesson in this. This is a magnitude 7 earthquake, but we did not see the most extreme shaking that can occur from a magnitude 7. We are fortunate, I think some other presenters may touch on this, but we do have good instrumental recordings around the downtown Anchorage area proper. That has seeded a lot of very interesting follow-on research to this event. I would point out that once you get outside of Anchorage proper, the quality, the availability of instrumental recordings goes down precipitously. As we worked to put together, you know, peak ground acceleration maps and things and similar products, we were certainly stretched to find suitable data to include outside of Anchorage proper. The products that many people are using, the shake map that you have been using distributed through the USGS, we made a conscious decision to include in that did you feel it reports. That's the verdict on how the suitability of that is still debated by some people, but we made a conscious decision to include those in the numerical calculations here because of the sparsity of data in outlying regions like Eagle River, Palmer, and other areas. Last figure, I just show where the instrumental recordings in red and actually the did you feel it derived or estimated values, guesstimated values in yellow, how they agree, their alignment with the ground motion prediction equation, ZAL 2006, that we use in our routine shaking product. So I think it did reasonably well at long distance. It seems to underestimate slightly the observed recordings, but overall we were reasonably pleased. So why don't I wrap it up there?
Thank you very much, Mike.
Sounds good.
So next we're going to hear from Amanda Siok. Amanda is the Earthquake, Tsunami, and Volcano Program Manager for FEMA Region 10, which covers Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington. She works on a wide range of projects ranging from public engagement and risk communication to GIS and hazard analysis. Amanda has been with FEMA since 2010 and holds a Master of Urban Planning with a specialization in natural hazard mitigation. She is passionate about connecting people to the active geologic landscapes that surround them. Welcome, Amanda.
Okay, well, I will go ahead and get started. Thank you for the introduction. As mentioned, I'm with FEMA Region 10, which covers Alaska, Idaho, Oregon, and Washington states. And I'm located in the mitigation branch, which typically focuses on before disaster and after disaster on the rebuilding. But I am going to go into FEMA's response process, how that worked, and then get into some of the next steps as well. I've got two pictures up on my slide right now. The first one on the left is damage from the Gruning Middle School, and we are just incredibly fortunate that there weren't any children in the hallways when this earthquake happened. They were all in their classrooms, but that's a picture of cinder blocks that have fallen through the suspended ceilings. The lockers were all dented, and just we're very lucky. The only known fatality from this earthquake is the picture here of the decapitated taxidermy. And I meant this as a joke, but an article actually came out yesterday about the increased workload of taxidermists in Alaska from the number of people with damage to them. So just a little bit of lightheartedness to the presentation as well. So we talked already about the initial event, Friday, November 30th, but FEMA activated locally here in Bothell, Washington, which is just north of Seattle. We activated our Response and Coordination Center, we call it the RRCC, to a level 1, which is the highest activation level that we have, and immediately began coordinating with the state of Alaska to find out what their needs were, you know, what damages were being seen, you know, did they need sheltering support, did they need food, water, things like that. We initially, rather immediately deployed our national IMAT team, it's the National Incident Management Team, to the State Emergency Operations Center up in Alaska, and there they played really a command and support role. So FEMA is not a first responder agency, we're a management agency. So they went up and supported the state at their Emergency Operations Center, helping them coordinate with other federal agencies, bringing in different players as needed and identifying what immediate needs were. And then at our local in Bothell, Washington, RRCC, we worked with FEMA's modeling branch. They're a really smart group that ran Hazus, which is FEMA's loss estimation software. I'll get into that in a minute. But using that USGS shake map, which Mike was just talking about. So Hazus is, I like to call it the Sim City for the government. We can put in local data, so building footprints, local infrastructure, things of that nature, and then we can model an earthquake using the shake map. So our initial Hazus results, which were done quite quickly, using federally based data sets, not using direct data from the local municipality. Estimated economic losses were 2.3 billion. It had some high shelter needs, and then gave us estimates for where damages and things would occur. So we use this information as well as the USGS pager report to inform our initial response needs. So as the state is still trying to understand what the damages are, what populations have been impacted and how severely, we rely on this pager and Hazus information to inform potential sheltering and feeding needs as well as medical needs. We work very closely with the American Red Cross during this process. And then we also have our own logistics group that coordinates directly with the state's logistics team to identify areas for staging supplies, you know, bringing out communication capabilities such as sat phones and things if needed, and then looking at, are there areas that are isolated? What do we need to do to be able to access them and get them needed supplies? So the pager report is incredibly useful for us. The Hazus report was, and the modeling done by our headquarters modeling team was also very helpful. We posted the information from our modeling onto FEMA's Geo platform, as well as in an earthquake incident journal. And I've got the link for this up here. And I guess for those of you that are looking at, if you have the slides already, I've made some updates with pictures and a little bit more information. But this link should work. I'm working with our GIS folks to better understand what information we can share and what we can't. PII information, personally identifiable information, can't be shared. And you know, we don't want to spread information that is not field verified either. But there are some pieces of this earthquake incident journal that are publicly available. So you can click that link and see what comes up for you. But initially, we were using the Hazus and the pager information to see, based off of the model, what areas were likely to be most impacted. And I'll get into that a little bit more in a moment. But you can see we were also pulling in the state, or rather the municipalities' information on red, yellow, and green tags for buildings being inspected. So this part is some of the red tape that you might hear about, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the disaster declaration process. So when the event happens, the initial earthquake, the state has to request the state makes a preliminary damage request. And upon initial event, there isn't a presidential declaration yet. So you'll hear words like emergency proclamations or maybe a local emergency declaration, but those are not the FEMA declarations signed by the president that issues funding. So in order to get the presidential declaration, there's some steps that have to happen first. So the state will make a PDA request, which is preliminary damage assessment, and that brings in local and state partners, as well as the Small Business Association, to go and do inspections for both public infrastructure as well as individual, which would be residential. In this instance, FEMA actually came along and did the PDA inspections with the state and local and SBA, which isn't typical, but it really helped us expedite some of our processing. So I'll get into what those specific inspections are like. Actually, I will do that now. So we brought in those teams. We brought in inspectors from all over the country. FEMA did. We coordinated with the Small Business Association. So we brought in a ton of people up to Anchorage to do these inspections, but a lot of them had never actually done seismic inspections before because there aren't that many earthquakes that happen of this scale in the US. So we leveraged some contract mechanisms with our headquarters team and brought in a structural engineer to do an abbreviated ATC 20 training, teaching all of these inspectors and field teams how to evaluate buildings and what to look for. We focused on determining what is minor damage, what would be major damage, and what is destroyed. So this is different than the red, yellow, green tags that many of the structural engineers were using because we weren't out there looking at building safety for occupancy. We were looking at damage classifications to support a presidential declaration request. So getting into this a little bit more, public facilities, be things publicly owned, so schools, roads, utilities, fire, police stations. You can see we had lots of teams out there. You know, we've got inspectors with the school district staff here. At one point, it was really neat, actually. The Anchorage School District got a school bus, and literally drove us around in buses with their staff and their engineers to go look at damages so they could point things out to us and show us what, you know, their big concerns were. So the public facilities inspections took place the week of December 17th. And we went to areas, the areas we chose to go and look at were informed by the state. And they made those decisions based on the request for assistance that they had already received, as well as being informed by state emergency management, collected information, local emergency management, as well as those pager and Hazus damage estimates. So we focused on reports that were assumed to be $100,000 or greater in damages, because the point of these assessments is really to see how much money are we seeing that is, how much money in damages we're seeing, so that we can support that request to the president to make federal funds available. So going on to the next slide for individual assistance, here's, again, more teams of people. We were literally driving the streets, going jurisdiction by jurisdiction, street by street, door to door, walking around, looking at damages. Sometimes people were home and would let us into their homes. Other times they weren't, and we would just walk around the perimeter. But again, impacted areas were informed by the state request for assistance, emergency management, Hazus, and local emergency management. We had members from the municipality of Anchorage driving around with us doing this, and they were able to pull up in real time the applications for assistance or for inspections, so that we could prioritize those areas. So if they got a report that our home was destroyed, we would then drive to that home and look and see, based off of our classifications, minor, major, or destroyed, what does it fit? And then we were in turn, in some of these pictures, you may have seen folks with iPads, they were updating this information in real time back to our staff at the State Emergency Operations Center, so that we could start compiling information to support the state's formal request for a disaster declaration. So you can see here, we've moved down the chain of events here. We've made the request, we've done preliminary damage inspections, and now the state requests a disaster declaration, which goes to the president. So the individual assistance assessments took place December 10th, or that week. December 17th was for the public damage assessment. Then it was Christmas, and then there was a government shutdown. So that really slowed things down quite a bit. The state shut down all of their staff on Saturday, the 22nd. The government shut down on Friday, the 21st at midnight. So there was a lot of time of just kind of sitting and waiting. But the state did release their request for declaration on January 3rd. If you're interested in what that looks like, you can actually access it on this link. Based off of the preliminary damage assessments, it was determined that the cost for the disaster was $48 million thus far. And again, that was with the focus on the high damage facilities. That doesn't include all the little tidbits of things that weren't inspected, because we were only focused on the big number things. But there is, through the Stafford Act, there is a threshold that has to be met that states that, the amount of the damage has to exceed the state's capabilities, and that's determined by census numbers multiplied by factor of, in this instance, it was the per capita indicator of $1.46 per person. So the state made that disaster declaration, and the shutdown eventually ended. We'll find out more tomorrow about that as well. But the declaration was made by President Trump on January 31st, and that provides public and individual assistance for 3 boroughs. It includes the municipality of Anchorage, the Matsu Borough, and the Kenai Peninsula Borough. And one fact that a lot of people don't realize is when there is a statewide disaster, there are disaster funds, but hazard mitigation money becomes available statewide, and that does include tribal lands. It is up to the state's discretion on where that money gets spent, and we'll get into that now. So now that we have the declaration, we have a budget for the disaster and can spend it. We have started opening up disaster recovery centers, or DRCs, that provide disaster survivor assistance to individuals. And that includes helping people apply for small business association loans, as well as signing them up for FEMA inspectors to come and inspect their home or to verify that the damage that they're claiming is actually from the earthquake. FEMA individual assistance money cannot exceed $34,000, $34,900 per person. So this surprises a lot of people. FEMA's assistance is not meant to make, it's meant to get you by. It's meant to help fill in the gaps between insurance coverage, essentially. We cannot duplicate insurance funds or state assistance. In this case, the state of Alaska has a very robust individual assistance program, which is amazing. A lot of states don't have that. So we do have these sites set up for individuals to apply for assistance and help them get connected with things like engineers, help answer some of their building questions. How do they, repair their homes? And these people are informed, the FEMA folks that are staffing these centers are informed on seismic mitigation best practices. Let's see here. So that's one small aspect, is working with the individuals. We also have a large team of people working with the state to help prioritize and identify applications for mitigation projects. So the state is working on getting a time frame put together for when they'll start accepting applications for these grants. Also working on state's training needs. So, should we do a training with building developers or home builders on seismic mitigation or seismic best practices? So we look directly at the state to tell us what to do, and we are working with them on that right now. We're also working to better understand earthquake insurance in Alaska and its limitations, and looking at potential improvements. The taxidermy thing at the beginning kind of started to be a joke, but then, looking at the amount of, taxidermy in Alaska, some of those bear mounts can be really expensive. So, would insurance cover that? Is it considered artwork? Is it, how does that work? And, there were so many people that did not have earthquake insurance. What do we do to make insurance for those folks more affordable, or better communicate the limitations of homeowners insurance and earthquake insurance? As well as, we've since learned that many of the insurance companies are, their event period is only 3 days. So that November 30th plus 3 days. So any damage that occurs after that would be susceptible to a new deductible. And if you're familiar with the high cost of deductibles for earthquake insurance, it's likely not affordable for most people. So we are putting together a team to better understand these limitations and try and brainstorm options and better outreach strategies to communicate those and see what can be done to make folks more resilient from the insurance standpoint. I talked about Hazus at the beginning. I do want to point out that we ran Hazus again using local data, and the results were they did not reflect real life in terms of what happened. And we have a strong group of GIS and Hazus users that are going to be diving into this to see what and why and how, because it should have been more accurate. So for those of you that are interested in that, please reach out to me and I can get you the invite. The meeting hasn't been scheduled yet, but for the next Pacific Northwest Hazus users group, we'll be getting into that. And I know I'm running short on time, but 2 other slides. Building codes and enforcement has been a really big thing that we've noticed, primarily that the Anchorage building service area did a great job with building codes and enforcing those, but areas like Eagle River and Chugiak are outside of that service area intentionally. They didn't want to be a part of it. and they were exempt from inspections as well as municipal review of permits, at least for residential structures. So, you know, seeing more damage there in those areas makes sense from the building code perspective. Since the earthquake, Chugiak has passed a resolution that they want municipal review of permits, and they are encouraging other jurisdictions or other local commissions to do the same. But obviously there is pushback from home builders and developers in that area because they're saying that will increase their costs. And I think as all the structural engineers on the phone right now, we're familiar with this argument, and it is there's lots of debates that could go for that. But what I did find really interesting is looking at these news articles where they're talking about building codes. I read the comment section, which is always a questionable thing to do, but I was really encouraged and inspired by people talking about how they do want more oversight and that it shouldn't be passed on to the homeowner to make sure that their home is built to the right standards. And then finally, the Gruning Middle School is one of the schools that was very highly damaged and won't be reopening, at least in the 2019-2020 school year. They're looking at, there's some pretty significant issues right now with where to put all these displaced students and, you know, the social impacts of putting middle schoolers in with high schoolers, things like that. And the Anchorage School District is doing a great job of engaging the community and asking them what they want. But an article came out yesterday, actually, that Gruning Middle School, which is located outside of the building service area, was a flawed structure upon its construction. It sounds like there were violations of the building code and just inherent design flaws. And in '84, so before the school was opened, a contract was awarded for repairs. The article didn't get into what those repairs were, but seeing how that school was so badly damaged, I think there's certainly some studies that can be done on what happened there and why, which gets at FEMA's kind of next steps from the mitigation standpoint is we want to be able to highlight the importance of building codes and regulations where they've worked. And I think Wael will get into some of the building performance in a few minutes, but if you're aware of or have information on buildings that have failed and why, or buildings that did not fail and why, please share that with me so that I can make sure that we get that compiled into a report for best practices for locals. So with that, just a few acknowledgements. First of all, everybody who works on the shake maps that has contributed to those are so helpful for us at FEMA. So thank you for contributing to those. That's USGS. I know Mike's group up at UAF. Thank you very much. Maggie, you were so helpful to me. I didn't know what a virtual clearinghouse was before this, so thank you. You were very helpful. Our FEMA GIS and Hazus modeling folks, Jesse Rozelle, Casey Zusak, and then Doug Bausch, who is with the Pacific Disaster Center. You guys helped so much with getting Hazus runs done. Barry Welliver with BHW Engineers came out and sat with me in Anchorage and was just so helpful with some of the more technical things. I'm not an engineer, so it was really nice to have someone interpreting things for me. And then Mike Mahoney with FEMA headquarters with building sciences was just, he's been invaluable. So it's really neat that so many people, so many smart people have been involved with this and everybody's working together, and I just appreciate everyone. So thank you. And I'm sorry for going over my time.
Thanks very much, Amanda. No problem. It was very interesting. But in the interest of time, I think we will go ahead and move on to our next speaker. Who is John Thornely. John is a geotechnical engineer with Boulder Associates in Anchorage. John works on a wide range of projects across Alaska, focusing on transportation and building infrastructure in thawed and permafrost sites. He is also chair of the Municipality of Anchorage Geotechnical Advisory Commission. And John is a PhD candidate at the University of Strathclyde, Glasgow, under the direction of Dr. John Douglas, concentrating on earthquake engineering. Thanks, John.
Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're at. Glad to be here today. Thank you, Maggie and the EERI for having me here. I hope that you can all see my screen and things are okay there. Just as an introduction to the geotechnical impacts, here's our poster child photo of geotechnical impacts. This is Vine Road in Wasilla. You can notice that there's a little bit of snow on the ground, and being November 30th, we'd had a month or so of cold, and so frost depths were on average about 12 to 18 inches deep, and so that impacted a bit of what we saw just in general. So I think it's important to note a little bit about the seasonality of this this earthquake, and that you know, the area that this earthquake occurred in, south central Alaska, is relatively free of permafrost. You know, there are some isolated pockets of perennially frozen ground, but we did have a seasonal frost aspect to it. So talking a little bit about the strong motions that we saw, you know, geology does matter, and here we can see some of the stations across the Anchorage Bowl. And as Mike West pointed out, there's a fairly dense array within the Anchorage area that drops off pretty rapidly at outside of the Anchorage area. But this shows you some of the variability that we saw across town based on the recordings that we observed at these strong motion stations in the blue triangles. And then moving to different parts of the acceleration spectra. Here's at 0.2 seconds. We see, I can give you a laser pointer. We can see that there's even more variability in the 0.2 second spectral acceleration area. And at different spots around town, you see quite high spectral accelerations, even above 1.2 G. We also see it, if you look at the 1 second acceleration response spectra, we see kind of the zone of higher amplifications with respect to other parts of Anchorage, and that has a lot to do with the underlying geology. The Bootlegger Cove Formation, which is fairly infamous for its impacts during the 1964 earthquakes, where we saw large ground movements and deformation. This Bootlegger Cove Formation material typically has a fundamental period of around 0.8 to 1.2 seconds, depending on the thickness. And so it's not surprising that you're seeing some amplification of that throughout the Anchorage Bowl. The geotechnical damages were not just limited to Anchorage, of course. We had quite a variety of different geotechnical impacts around south central Alaska. Numerous structures were impacted by ground failure of different types. We did see liquefaction. And we also saw some lateral spreading, and some of the lateral spreading may have been a result of having that frozen crust over a liquefied zone. Settlement of poor quality fill materials. We saw numerous indications of fill materials that had settled due to the ground shaking, causing a significant impact structurally to residential structures primarily, but we saw this in commercial and public buildings as well. Then we saw a number of slope displacements as well. We saw these primarily in fill materials, but there were a few natural slopes also that that had indications or showed signs of movement. Interestingly enough, talking with the USGS, who did a number of flyovers to evaluate whether slope reactivation or slope instability reactivation from some of the 1964 slides. They wanted to see whether those had reactivated, and saw very little sign of reactivation of those slopes. And so the primary bad actor tended to be in the fill slope area. So talking a little bit about different elements of the geotechnical impacts, a lot of people saw liquefaction within their crawl spaces. Floor slabs in residences were found to settle in some areas, and clean sand was found as ejecta, both in structures and in neighborhoods. The picture in the middle here shows a sewer outlet. That now the sewer outlet is a little bit higher than the facilities that it's tied to, causing an impact on say flushing of toilets. You can see the sand that has come into this crawl space here that was once covered in visqueen, but now is covered in fine sand. A neighborhood with sand boils between concrete and asphalt pavements. So numerous sites of liquefaction were observed. Saw some lateral spreading. Most of the lateral spreading that I'm aware of was fairly minor. This is an example of a poorly placed fill material that moved laterally towards a pond within the Anchorage area. The cracks were roughly 4 to 5 feet deep, but only a few inches of vertical displacement and lateral movement. So lateral spreading did occur, but was fairly minor in locations observed. Here's this settlement issue. There's a lot of talk within the Anchorage area right now whether fill settled during the events, or whether this was liquefaction damage. But numerous geotechnical engineers that I've been speaking with have indicated that these fill materials may have been poorly compacted and caused quite a bit of damage. Oftentimes, we pride ourselves in Alaska for the off-the-grid nature and kind of the frontier state. And so when you have an uncle or someone with a piece of yellow iron, a grader or something, and they help you build your building pad, maybe you didn't get compaction testing and verification of proper fill placement as you go to build on these areas outside of the building service area, certainly, as Amanda pointed out. And so there is some concern there that while maybe the house was built to code, or these structures were built to code, the soils that supported them may not have been, which then caused some damage. On the, to follow up with Amanda on the building service area, the building service area, as she noted, is primarily focused in the Anchorage Bowl, and then outside of that, there's the option to follow the building code or not. And what we did see was there's quite a bit of damage, both to structures and others, and I'm sure Wael will fill us in on some of that, but we saw a disproportionate amount of damage in areas outside of the building service area than within. Slope displacement again relating to poor quality fills potentially. Another poster child photograph of the interchange going to the airport, International Airport for Anchorage. Somewhat busy area, but again, not necessarily related to liquefaction, but potentially soft ground and poorly placed fill materials. Lateral displacement of fill slopes. We seem to see quite a few fill slopes that have displaced. Some of them more significantly than others. In this photo, you can see slope displacement indicators at the top of the slope, but also coming back towards the house. And this was fairly common as people expand their lots and push materials out. Some of the questions about this fill placement, are proper or improper native slope preparation. Were good practices imposed with benching and keying in the slopes, removing organics off the original slopes, and other construction-related practices. And so as engineers go to study some of these things and to help homeowners and other owners of structures get back on their feet, these will be things that we'll be seeing more results of whether we had improper fill placement or not. And we primarily saw these in residential areas as well as roadway embankments. And a little side note on the roadway embankments, oftentimes with AASHTO design, we're allowed to, if we have a low factor of safety from an equivalent or from a numerical model factor of safety below 1, then we can also design for displacement. And so when we have accelerations like we saw from the November 30th earthquake, when you do a back analysis, it's not a real surprise that we saw slope displacement on some of these steeper slopes, 1.5 to 1 to 2 to 1 slopes that indicate in our calculations that we should see some movement. We're not terribly surprised that we do see some of those movements. Natural slopes, there were very few natural slopes that actually moved or were observed to fail. This is a photo of one of them in the south part of Anchorage, where upon further investigation and view, you can see that, you can see in this photo that there was some movement there, but a lot of this primarily had to do with saturated slopes. And in areas where, adjacent to these and not seeing seeps come out of the embankment, you can assume that maybe they were a little drier and had less saturation. But again, there were very few natural slope displacements. One of the significant differences between the 1964 earthquake and the November 30th earthquake, other than magnitude, was the duration of shaking. The shaking lasted for roughly 20 to 30 seconds, whereas it's documented that in the 1964 earthquake we had greater than 4 minutes of shaking. And so if we had gone for, say, another minute or two, we might have seen further damage to these natural slopes, but we just didn't quite see that. And probably for the benefit of South Central Alaska too. Touching on buried utilities, Anchorage Water and Wastewater Utility recommended boiling water for several days after the earthquake due to some water line damages. There is a work in progress right now to collect that damage information, and EERI will be tying that into our summary report, and so be looking for that. But there's, as I pointed out in the liquefaction slide, a number of connection issues with residences and others due to some liquefaction damage. But all in all, there appears to be a relation to older water and wastewater, older wastewater and water utilities, and some of the damage that was experienced. But more to follow on that. One kind of interesting off the, not on your typical track here is the impacts to water wells, and there were a number of observations of dirtier water in the days following the earthquake. A surprising number of people are on community wells or individual wells, even within the Anchorage Bowl. And then as you move outside of Anchorage, nearly everyone is on a well that's not on some of these more built-out areas. And so there were some issues with pitless adapters shearing off, observed turbidity, and then the lab testing suggests at this point that while there was an increase of testing, there hasn't been an increase in E. coli or bacteria. But one thing that's worth noting is that in the spring, as we start getting surface melt and other things, we'll see potentially if there are other impacts to water wells. So in conclusion, the earthquake highlighted the importance of geotechnical best practices. There is significant structural damage that's been attributed to geotechnical failures, and the ground motions, at least across the Anchorage area, varied certainly with geology. And as we continue to work with others to look at the strong motion stations outside of Anchorage, I'm sure that we'll see something fairly similar to that. Liquefaction, lateral spreading, poorly placed fills, and some slope failures are the primary geotechnical failures. And then impacts to buried structure or buried utilities are a work in progress. And just to point out, this 12 inches of frost that we had may be masking issues that we may end up seeing more of in the spring as seasonal frost thaws out. So, and with that, and acknowledgement of our time here, I'll just throw this acknowledgements slide up as we transfer to my colleague Wael.
Thanks very much, John. As John said, next we're going to hear from Dr. Wael Hassan. He's an associate professor of structural earthquake engineering at the University of Alaska Anchorage. He obtained his PhD in structural engineering at the University of California, Berkeley, where he was also a postdoc. He is a licensed structural engineer in California, where he led the tall building performance-based design practice at SOM San Francisco. His research interests include simulation and large-scale testing of structural systems and components under extreme hazards, seismic assessment of existing infrastructure, and performance-based design. He served on several guideline committees in ACI and ASE. Welcome, Wael.
Thank you, Maggie. Thank you, everyone, for joining today this webinar presentation. I'm going to present on the structural and non-structural damage observed during after this earthquake. And basically, I'm going to go over a few points here in terms of like generalized observations. There's minor structural damage in general to engineered buildings. There's moderate to heavy structural damage to non-engineered buildings, and unfortunately, it happened to be there's quite a few here in some areas that are not necessarily under code conformance or enforcement. And of course, there was no fatalities or serious injuries during this earthquake. We're very lucky to have that. And there's also moderate to heavy non-structural damage everywhere, and also equipment and water damage. And it is really instructive to compare the damage from this earthquake to the 2011 magnitude 6.2 Christchurch earthquake of a pretty similar epicentral distance, but which is much shallower. It was about 3 miles shallow compared to that one. So basically, it is, in my opinion, like many others, think that most of the observed damage, which is less than anticipated from such a large magnitude earthquake, was basically hindered because of the large depth of the earthquake and the short duration. And of course, in part, is the engineered building codes and the strict building codes in Alaska, which we can see the differences between the damage in Anchorage and also in northern communities in Eagle River and north to Anchorage. So a little bit of background of building codes here. So after the 1964 earthquake, there was major change in building code regulations to include the seismic regulation and tighten them a little bit, and leading also to the near 1975 formation. But the seismic details actually did not get into the building construction here until about mid-80s or early 80s at least. So, but as of now, the building code, the international building code that is in force is 2012 IBC, and which is like 1 or like 2 cycles behind for some logistical reasons. And there's also the local Alaska Building Code amendments that relate to the specific Alaska considerations like frozen ground and geotechnical aspects. It's very important to note here that the level of enforcement varies a lot between different areas. So with Anchorage is the most well-enforced region compared to the other cities around northern Anchorage and southern to Anchorage, and in other parts and other boroughs also in Alaska. So that might have helped explain the different types of damage we've seen around the area. So I'm not going to go over details of the shaking map again, but it's just like to do some correlation to the observed damage. So we can see here the municipality of Anchorage inspection map in the south. Here we see Anchorage, here's northern communities, and that's about 10 to 15 days after the earthquake. And we see here like the distribution of red tags and versus yellow and green tags. And if we close up a little bit on that, we see here, this is Anchorage on the left, and these are the northern communities here. And we try to see some correlation between the distribution of red and yellow tags here in Anchorage and the shaking maps. And we note that it's pretty well correlated in most regions, except maybe in South Anchorage where the most shaking took place, because primarily that is more like 1 or 2 story residential building. Most of them are new buildings that are upscale kind of buildings. So that might have explained the reason, but we're still looking into that. Why was there wasn't so much damage here? And the map says that the new map is coming, and it's more advanced, and this includes much more information. And I hope I can show that during the EERI meeting next month. And also that in the light of the spectral acceleration, the 0.2 second spectral acceleration and the 1 second spectral acceleration, we can also help show us the correlation to damage. So it's very good to take some time to look at correlating damage to the accelerations here. So this map shows the municipality of Anchorage inspection data as of yesterday. And basically in Anchorage, there was total about 3,000 requests for inspection, or a little more. And we see here in Anchorage area that the out of the inspected buildings, which are about 1,300 buildings, there was 28 red tags, and the 28 red tags represent about 0.025% of the building stock in the municipality versus 606 for yellow tags. If we compare those numbers in the northern communities, where basically we have about 851 buildings inspected, and we have about 0.43% red tags, that represents 62 red tags representing 0.43% of the building stock in the northern communities, which is about 17 to 22 times the ratio in Anchorage. And again, that emphasizes the enforcement of building code in the northern communities is very weak, if any present actually. So, and I have to point out here that it is not only in residential construction, it's also in commercial buildings, retail buildings. So there is no building code enforcement even for those ones. So, and we've seen a lot of non-structural damage and some structural damage in those two, in the non-residential buildings. So I'm going to summarize very quickly some of the observations in the structural and non-structural and equipment damage, and then we go over some examples. So a lot of the structural damage was due to ground failure, as John has said earlier, and most was in the single-family residential building foundations. And there's also a lot of non-ground related light to moderate structural damage, as I said, and we'll see some examples shortly. So there's like in older construction, as we may kind of expect to see, like problems cracking in shear walls, We also see the CMU wall cracking and detachment from floors and from framing. And we see also the CMU diagonal cracks. We see out of plane masonry wall buckling. And also we see the wall foundation offset from the buildings, and detachment of wood wall corners in residential buildings. So those are the most common types of structural damage that we observe. In terms of the non-structural damage, the most common observed was the glass facades, of course, and windows in low-rise buildings, and also a lot of suspended ceiling tile falling and damage, including the entire grid, not only the tiles, or it's like entire grid and sometimes snapping whole segments of the ceiling. And of course, the firefighting system damage and sprinkler head and water pipe damage was very widespread in different types of building, especially at connections. We also saw a lot of masonry veneer cracking and detachment, and significant drywall, significant cracking everywhere. There is also the cosmetic and the sometimes major cracking around openings, and partition walls also experience a lot of damage. And the equipment damage that was repeatedly observed, that most of the time caused the water flooding, was primarily due to water boiler sliding. And this sliding led to the detachment or the breakage of the water pipe connections to the boiler, which led to major flooding in most cases. We've seen that in many buildings. And sometimes it even was internal boiler cracking and electrical panel failure due to the water damage. And I'm going to show a few examples in residential buildings. You can see here the corner opening here at the wood buildings, see the detachment of the parking shed structure from the building, and you see permanent deformation here for this residential building. And that's another view of the building that John has shown earlier. And this is a whole masonry wall damage here. Also, that's another building in Matsu Valley. We see heavy structural damage to this building. This is the corner damage out there. And we see from the interior of this building major cracking in the walls and the detachment at the corners, and like very wide cracks here. And that's some other pictures from the same building. And we see here masonry masonry confinement to heater damage in Matsu Boruto for residential. In terms of examples for commercial building, most of the commercial buildings here in Anchorage experienced those damages of water breakage and some suspended ceiling slab failure, but few experienced the major segments of the ceiling falling, including the grids. So here we see some of the masonry veneer failure in Eagle River, and this has become now a widespread picture of the masonry wall problem connection here at the top, and this wall, and like many other in Eagle River that have the same configurations, have been already propped this way, as you see. And that's some other more, of course, in Eagle River was more heavier damage, as we said. So in suspended ceiling, sometimes the entire ceiling was gone, and the glass windows of stores and commercial buildings too. So another example from Eagle River, heavier water damage and failure of the suspended ceiling of the entire store. Examples from Anchorage show in office buildings showing here the CMU wall connection to the steel girders. We see the steel joists coming off the seat of the wall, as we see here. And that resulted in a failure of the segments of the roof, as we see. And that has been a common problem, even in Anchorage, not only in Eagle River, with CMU wall to steel girder connections. So another example from office buildings in Anchorage, we see the foundation of the braces in some brace frame structure, showing splitting and damage crack, and also the grout pads underneath the plate is already damaged. and also underneath the steel columns, we see the same thing. And that might be, in my opinion, some explanation explained by the eccentricity, torsional eccentricity in the building. I don't think that was related to some geotechnical or foundation problem. So also there's widespread sprinkler damage to the ceiling, as we see here. This photo is very typical. In some of the high rises in Anchorage, like this concrete block hotel, which is about 14-story. So we see here the shear cracks of the girder that's being treated now, of the girder at the ground floor. And it's worth noting here that this crack was in the beginning was really small, and then due to aftershocks, it kept widening until it reached about 0.25 inch wide, and led to the whole shutdown of the building and to the retrofit immediate need for the building. And in the same building at the top floor, mechanical floor, we see the boiler problem. So according to Alaska Building Code, those boilers, big boilers, needed not to be strapped or tied to the floor, because basically the hazard of overturning for this large size was not actually there. But what happened, they slid. Instead of like overturning, they slid significantly, leading to a breakage of those connections at the top and water flooding of the entire floor and the floors below. You see here in Anchorage, also in some mid-rise buildings, we see some column flexural yielding potential and some internal cracking in the connection between the core wall and the dry wall. We see here also in some mid-rise building in Anchorage, also the heavy cracking and damage at the facade. I'm going to show some more examples through the performance of the instrumented buildings. There is about 7 instrumented buildings here in Anchorage. Some of them were not able to retrieve the full record, and some others we were able to do that. So giving the example of Atwood building, which is 20-story steel frame shear wall building in 1982, and this is the instrumentation scheme, and you see here that it has about 0.23 G acceleration at the ground level and about 0.41 and 0.44 accelerations at the roof level, and the damage was not measured to this building, basically non-structural damage. And as we see here, the floor, the suspended ceiling grade, and the water flooding also is evident. And also we see here, this is basically where the water flooding took place, and this was damaged during the earthquake and led at the mechanical floor and led to major water damage. And it's related very well to the recorded accelerations at different floor level. This is another instrumented building, which is the Frontier building in Midtown Anchorage, and we see here that there is some splitting, overstress splitting crack in concrete column here, but it was minor, and there was no water damage in this building, but there was also some cosmetic drywall cracking and ceiling cracking, as we see. Not heavy though. This is a British Petroleum building in Anchorage, and there was no major structural cracking or problems. They're basically water damage again due to water piping and firefighting system failure. This is another instrumented building, which is the engineering building, the new engineering building on University of Alaska campus. And this is a 4-story moment frame building. It's relatively new, and it's experienced very light non-structural damage. And as we see here, some drywall cracking and cabinet failure. So there wasn't major structural damage, and the damage correlated well to the recorded acceleration at different floors. It's very well instrumented building here in Anchorage. And of course, talking about school damage, and it's major non-structural damage that took place in many schools in Anchorage and Mat-Su school districts. That was very significant. Some schools experienced heavy structural damage, especially in Eagle River and Mat-Su, and led to shutting down some of those schools. And those are 4 to 5 schools. The rest of the schools in the Mat-Su, about 50 schools, had minor non-structural equipment or furniture damage. In the Anchorage School District, there was about 85 of the 97 schools experienced light to heavy non-structural damage and water flooding. And we see examples here. And we also see some examples in Matsu. We have a shear wall crack here in Matsu, and we have also the Mesa CMU wall detachment from the steel girder connection. That's another example in Matsu School where we see the CMU wall here damage, exposing the steel frame column. And we also see the deformation of the ventilation system here in the gymnasium room. And we see also some ceiling failure that led to very heavy blocks falling off. Fortunately, there wasn't any students here. Some more CMU to steel connection failures and suspended ceiling failures in Matsu. And we see also here in this basketball court, we see this is very newly constructed ceiling here, and we see a lot of failure of the tiles of the ceiling. They are very heavy. They are estimated to be about 30 pounds each. So fortunately, there wasn't any students here, so nobody got injured. In Eagle River also, there was lots in the school district from the masonry, CMU problems, and detachment from the structural framing. And as we see here in those pictures, and that's the picture that Amanda showed earlier. Eagle River schools again. And regarding University of Alaska campus, there were 70 buildings there inspected thoroughly. 5 of those buildings experienced some more heavier damage, including water damage, non-structural damage, and ceiling damage, as we see. And again, those are very heavy wooden tiles that fell off in some cases, and fortunately, nobody got injured. Here is the University of Alaska Anchorage Eagle River campus, which was heavily damaged. This is an office building, was heavily damaged, non-structural damage, and a few points of structural damage there. So we see here a wall, a partition wall that needed to be propped, this outer plane unstable, and there was like major water damage in this building that spanned the 3 floors of the building, needed replacement of the entire lower part of the walls everywhere, and more damage from that same building, Eagle River campus, non-structural damage. Regarding hospital damage and healthcare facility, there are 3 major hospitals in Anchorage. So without identifying which is which based on the request, so I'm just showing some concrete shear wall damage in one of the hospitals and main building. And this hospital is a little bit older building, non-ductile concrete. And we see more cracks here, minor cracks about 1/8 of an inch. Water flooding in some outpatient buildings was very significant that led to shutting down 2 outpatient clinic buildings for extensive amount of time. And then 10 days later or 2 weeks later, they returned with about 20% capacity. Here we see some more damage in one of the hospitals, and we see like the facade wall damage from below and ceiling damage, expansion joint or seismic joint damage that was typical throughout the hospitals, and water damage, of course. And we see on this picture on the right, electrical switch problems that led to replacing the entire electric system. We can see here also that this resulted in some major problems with the MRI facility here that led to moving the MRI facility somewhere else to some off-campus location. Water damage, typical sprinkler damage, as we see here. And this is another water damage from a different hospital to the piping. And we see also masonry veneer cracking. Again, the problem of boiler damage at the top of the building. One of the hospitals experienced that boiler connection damage that led to major flooding in the building, that led finally to sounding the alarm for fire. So, which based on the short circuit that took place in this electrical panel. Same problem happened again in Matsu Regional Hospital, where the boiler connection slid, leading to some failure in the connections at the bottom. In that same hospital also, there is some top concrete slab cracking, as we see here, due to the earthquake. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the bridges, and as this picture shows, there was widespread highway and bridge locations experienced some damage, basically there was about 245 bridge structures, but 20 of them only experienced light to moderate structural damage. So the Anchorage bolt bending was a major damage that happened in different locations here. Also regarding the wing wall and hydro wall cracks, there is at least one location experienced the wing wall crack. The hydro wall crack was more spread out. The abutment cracking as such is a typical case within those 20 bridge locations. And also the bridge bearing large displacements and the bridge bearing pads fracture and splitting as such was also typical. Shear keys experienced damage ranging from very light to very severe, as you see here. So different, starting from cracking all the way to spalling and exposing reinforcement. So shear key was a problem in this earthquake in bridges. Some of the pier pile intersection resulted in some spalling as such. And there was also lateral displacement, transverse displacement of the bridge and longitudinal displacement of the bridge that happened in a few locations at different bridges. I'm not going to talk much about lifelines. The last thing, there was major power outage. I personally experienced that in my own house. There was about 15,000 requests for service across the area, and they were restored very, very swiftly. So within 24 hours to a few days, most of them were already restored. And more information on the utilities and the lifeline problems can be found in this report, the EERI VERT report, with this table summarizing what was the initial damage status. And I will be reporting in EERI annual meeting more detailed information on the lifelines as they still are coming in from the utilities companies. Finally, I'd like to acknowledge Janice Rogers and Chris Mutter, John Thornely, helping so much in this earthquake reconnaissance, Municipality of Anchorage, the Alaska DOT, Oakville Dota at University of Alaska Anchorage, University of Alaska Anchorage Civil Engineering and the facilities, PEER at UC Berkeley, Anchorage Mayor and the facility management teams at utilities companies, hospitals, Frontier Building, and British Petroleum. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Wael, and to all our speakers. Thank you for participating. Bye.